The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Vernon Dursley noticed it at once. It was sitting on top of the other post, and it was wrong in a way he could not immediately name. The paper was too heavy, cream-colored rather than white, and the address was not printed but written, precisely and deliberately, in emerald green ink. First, he stood in the open doorway of number 4, Privet Drive, in his good overcoat, his briefcase still in his hand, the November cold pressing in at his back, and he stared at it for a moment before he bent to pick it up. The address said Mr. H. Potter, 4 Privet Drive, I've Little Whinging, Surrey. He was Vernon Dursley. This was his house, his name on the mortgage, his lawn, his gutters, his car cleaned each Sunday in the drive. There had never been a Mr. H. Potter at this address, not for more than 3 weeks, and even then the Mr. in question was 1 year and 3 months old and hardly in a position to receive correspondence. The return address was stamped in gold foil pressed into the cream paper, Gringotts Wizarding Bank, Diagon Alley, London. Vernon's jaw tightened. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, thick through the neck, a fact he was aware of and did not dislike, and his jaw, when it tightened, meant something. He had a small, very neat moustache, and beneath it his mouth drew into a line. He knew that name. He had not known it 3 weeks ago, before the old man in the peculiar purple cloak had left the child and the letter on his doorstep in the dead of night. The letter, which he had read once, then folded into quarters and pushed to the back of his sock drawer, where he did not intend to look at it again, had been thorough. He would give the old man that. He had learned things he had not wanted to learn. The boy's name, the boy's history, the fact that the boy was, in the wider world the Dursleys declined to acknowledge, rather famous. And in passing, as a man mentions a coin left on a mantelpiece, the letter had noted that the child had a vault at Gringotts, that his affairs were in order, that this was nothing to worry about. Vernon had not given the vault a second thought until now. He stood in the hallway and turned the envelope over in his hands. The paper made a stiff, almost formal sound when he flexed it. A wax seal on the back, dark green, embossed with a small goblin head that he took for the bank's insignia. On the front, below the address, his eye caught a narrow strip of paper affixed along the bottom edge of the envelope. Recipient signature required upon delivery. Vernon stood very still. He was not a man given to philosophizing. 35 years had taught him that most problems yielded to routine, and routine was maintained by keeping one's house in order, the bills paid, the car serviced, the accounts balanced to the penny. He was good at this. He had built the life he intended to build, a solid, ordinary, correct life, and he did not propose to let anything unsettle it. He had already absorbed, in the last 3 weeks, a series of arrangements he found deeply unwelcome, and he had absorbed them without complaint, because there was no alternative, and he was, above all, a practical man. The boy was here. He was staying, that part was finished, and now the boy's bank was writing to him. He thought about the fireplace in the sitting room. The paper would take 30 seconds. He could be washing his hands before Petunia had the kettle on. He stood with the envelope and thought about the fireplace for rather longer than 30 seconds. Then he thought about what happened if he threw it away, and they sent another. They would send another. That was how banks operated. He ran a company. He understood the mechanics of institutional correspondence. There would be a follow-up notice, then a more strongly worded one, then possibly a visit. He did not know what a visit from Gringotts Wizarding Bank looked like, but the word goblins was printed on the return address in quite confident gold lettering, and this was not a prospect he found calming. He picked up the pen from the hall table. He signed his name on the strip at the bottom of the envelope, compact, controlled, no flourish, the way he signed everything. And then he broke the wax seal. The letter inside was 1 page. Wow. Cream paper, the same weight as the envelope, with an engraved letterhead. Gringotts Wizarding Bank, established. And here a date in Roman numerals he didn't bother to pass. The salutation was formal. Dear Mr. Potter. Then a single careful paragraph. He read it standing at the hall table with his coat still on. It was a vault statement. Annual summary of account activity. No deposits, no withdrawals. Holdings described in currency he could not convert to pounds or pence, galleons and sickles and knoots, denominations that meant nothing to him. But among the descriptions of what the vault contained, the words mounds and columns appeared, and those words meant something regardless of denomination. The statement named the account holder as Harry James Potter Minor, and noted in formal letters that somehow managed to convey mild institutional displeasure that the account had no designated magical guardian of record. No designated magical guardian of record. Vernon read that line twice. The statement closed with a single line. Annual statements will continue to be issued to the address of record until the account holder reaches majority. Please direct any queries to the Accounts Department. Gringotts Wizarding Bank, Diagon Alley. He folded the letter along its original crease lines. He put it back in its envelope. He walked to his study at the end of the hallway, a small, tidy room with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a shelf of Grunning's trade catalogues arranged by year. And he opened the bottom drawer of the desk, the one with the little lock he had never had occasion to use. He put the envelope inside. He locked the drawer. He placed the key in his trouser pocket, next to his car keys, where it settled against his thigh with the specific, unobtrusive weight of a thing that was now his. He stood in the quiet of his study and breathed. He was not a thief. He wished to be very clear with himself on this point. He had never taken anything in his life that did not belong to him. He was a director of a company that manufactured drill bits. He was a householder. He was a ratepayer. He was, by any reasonable measure, an upstanding man. But the envelope in the drawer was addressed to a child who could not read, could not walk, could not speak 2 consecutive words, who lay upstairs in the second bedroom, making small sounds at the ceiling and grabbing at things with pink, unfocused fists. A child who would not miss what he did not know he had. The words, "no designated magical guardian of record," sat in Vernon's mind like a stone in still water. He had not asked for the boy. He had not asked for any of this. The letter, the old man's purple cloak, the white-bearded certainty with which the whole arrangement had been visited upon him and his family, without consultation. The boy was here because someone had decided he would be here, and the vault was there because the boy's parents had left it to him, and the statement was in Vernon's desk drawer. Because Vernon had signed for it, and what he did with the information was, as far as he could see, a matter entirely within his own discretion. He heard Petunia on the stairs. Her footsteps were light and quick. He could always tell hers from Dudley's heavy rocking toddle. She appeared in the study doorway a moment later. She was carrying the boy on her hip. Harry, not Dudley. Dudley would be in his room. And she was very neat despite the hour, her pale hair combed, her blouse unwrinkled, 'cause Petunia was always neat. She was a thin woman, angular, at the elbows and jaw, and she looked at Vernon the way she sometimes looked at things when she already knew more than she was saying. She had grown up with Lily Evans. She knew what a wizarding envelope looked like. There was post, Vernon said. Petunia's gaze moved, very briefly and very deliberately, toward the desk. Not to the drawer specifically. She couldn't have known about the drawer, but to the desk, to the surface of it, which was clear. Then back to Vernon. The boy on her hip grabbed at her collar with one small fist and regarded the middle distance with his mother's eyes. He had her eyes. Exactly that particular shade of green, unnervingly vivid, and his hair stood up in all directions. Dark and hopeless, the way it would always stand, it seemed, regardless of what you did with it. "I see," said Petunia, very quietly. She did not ask what had come. She did not ask what he had done with it. She turned from the doorway and carried the boy back up the stairs, and Vernon heard her footsteps on the landing, and then the quiet, certain sound of a door closing. He stood alone in his study. The drawer was locked. The key was in his pocket. The room was exactly as it always was. Catalogues filed by year, the surface of the desk clear, except for the telephone and the blotter, everything in its place, everything under control. He had not done anything irreversible. He had signed for a letter, and he had put it somewhere safe, and that was all. Nothing had been decided, nothing had been taken. He could, he told himself, think about it later. He turned off the light and went upstairs to help with dinner. The drawer was unlocked on a Tuesday in March. Petunia Dursley was not the sort of woman who opened other people's drawers. She knew this about herself with some satisfaction. She was the sort of woman who kept a clean house and minded her own affairs because prying was vulgar, and vulgarity was the one thing she could not forgive in a person. She had been this way all her life. She had had to be. She noticed the drawer was unlocked because she noticed everything. It was how she was built. She moved through her own house like a surveyor, registering the position of objects, the state of surfaces, the small displacements that meant something needed attention. The desk drawer in Vernon's study had always been locked, since the November 2 years ago when he had first locked it. This was a fact she had filed away without examining it, because she already knew what was in the drawer, and there was a difference, she had told herself, between knowing a thing and deciding you were going to look at it directly. She stood in the doorway of the study for a long moment. Then she went in, pulled out the chair, sat down, and opened the drawer. There were 3 envelopes inside, stacked in order. Cream paper, gold foil on the return address, emerald green ink. Each of them had a strip along the bottom where the wax had been broken and resealed clumsily, because Vernon was not a man who thought about presentation once a thing was done. Each had a line at the bottom of the front face where a name had been pressed into the paper in ballpoint pen. V. Dursley. V. Dursley. V. Dursley. She picked up the earliest one. She unfolded it. When she was done, she folded it along its crease lines and put it back. She read the second. She did not open the third. She had understood enough. She sat in Vernon's chair for a little while. She could hear Harry somewhere in the house, a small exploratory noise, the particular persistence of a 2-year-old, somewhere near the kitchen. Dudley was asleep upstairs. She could hear him breathing through the monitor in the hall. She put the envelopes back in the drawer. She pressed it shut until the lock caught. Then she went to the locksmith's on the high street and had a key cut. She told them it was for a filing cabinet. They did not ask. She kept her key in the change purse inside her handbag between 2 obsolete bus tokens, where it would never be found by anyone looking for anything in particular. She had wanted to go to Hogwarts. This was not something she talked about. It was not something she thought about in the years after, because thinking about it accomplished nothing, and she was a practical woman. But when she read the vault statement, the careful handwriting, describing a fortune she could not quantify, held in the name of a child who could not yet tie his shoes, something moved in her chest that she had not expected, something old and specific and sharp, like the edge of a thing she had put down a long time ago and then stepped on in the dark. She had written to Dumbledore. Bah! She had been 12 years old, and Lily had been 11, and the letter had come for Lily on a Saturday morning in September, and it had said Hogwarts, and it had meant magic, and it had meant that Lily would go somewhere Petunia could not follow. She had written to the headmaster herself. A careful, correct letter, because even at 12, Petunia Evans was careful and correct, asking whether there might be a place for her as well. He had written back. The letter was kind, in the way that letters are kind when they intend to disappoint you, and it had explained that there was no place at Hogwarts for people without magical ability, and that he hoped she would find happiness in the path that had been chosen for her. The path that had been chosen for her, she had burned the letter in the garden. She had become, in the years that followed, a person who did not discuss magic and did not discuss Lily, and did not discuss the particular kind of loneliness that comes from growing up beside someone extraordinary when you yourself are not. She had become, instead, a person who kept a very clean house. And then Lily had died, and the boy had appeared on the doorstep, and now the boy's vault statement sat in a locked drawer in the study, and it said mounds, it said columns, it said Harry James Potter, minor, account holder, and she was the one doing the washing up. She could not look at him. She knew she should. She knew it was wrong not to. In the same vague, structural way, she knew plenty of things were wrong and did them anyway, because the alternative was looking at him and seeing her sister, and she was not able to do that. She was not able to do it when he was 2, and she was not able to do it when he was 3, and she suspected she would not be able to do it when he was 7 or 10 or grown. His eyes were lilies, the exact shade of green, unnervingly vivid in a small face. You could see it even when she was not trying to look. It was the detail she had known, before she picked up the first envelope, and it was the detail that made the key in her purse feel heavier than a key ought to. In 1985, Vernon asked one evening after dinner, in a very ordinary tone, whether she knew what was in the drawer. "Yes," she said. He nodded. They were washing up together. She washed, he dried, because he was too large to manage the sink comfortably and had broken 2 glasses the one time she'd left him to it. They stood in silence for a moment, the water running. "We're not taking the money," Vernon said. It was not a question. It had the quality of a thing he had already decided and was simply announcing, so that the record could be formally established. "No," Petunia said. The distinction mattered to him. She understood that. He was a man who drew very precise lines and needed to be certain that the line was in the correct place. They had signed for letters addressed to this house, which was their house. They had kept those letters secure. They had not touched the vault, not a single withdrawal in 4 years of statements, and she had checked. She read the statements now. She had a key. She could check. The vault was the boys, and would remain the boys. They were not thieves. They were only people who had decided what the boy needed to know, and when. "He won't ask," Vernon said. "He's 5. 5-year-olds don't ask about banks." Petunia said nothing to that. In 1987, he asked about the bicycle. He was 7 years old, thin in the way. He was always thin, clothes Dudley had outgrown, hanging off him as though they had been designed for someone larger, and the wearer was a temporary measure, and he had been weeding the front garden all afternoon. She had given him a trowel and shown him which plants were weeds, because there were things he could be useful for, and weeding was one of them. He came inside in the late afternoon, while Dudley was in the sitting room with the television, and he washed his hands at the kitchen sink, without being told, which was the sort of small, deliberate act she could not acknowledge without acknowledging that she had noticed it. "Petunia," he said. He called her Petunia because she had told him to, early on, because aunt was something she would have had to earn. She was at the sink. She did not turn around. Dudley's bicycle is too small for him now, Harry said. He said he wants a new one for his birthday. A pause. The television made noise in the other room. Would I get one when it's my birthday? She did not answer. The question was so small. She was aware of this, standing at the sink with her hands in the warm water. He was asking about a bicycle. He was asking, with a 7-year-old's reasonable and devastating logic, why his cousin was given things that he was not. He did not know about the drawer. He did not know that there were 7 envelopes in it now, 7 signatures, 7 annual assurances from Gringotts Wizarding Bank that the vault of Harry James Potter Minor remained untouched and waiting, its contents described in words, mounds. Heaps. That would mean nothing to a boy who slept in a cupboard and had never owned anything in his life that had been bought new. She heard him go back outside without waiting for an answer. She stood at the sink and listened to the television from the other room and the slow sound of the water, running cold, and outside in the garden the muffled, barely audible sounds of a 7-year-old boy who had learned very young to take up as little space as possible. The drawer was ajar on a Wednesday morning in July. Harry noticed it the way he noticed most things, not immediately, not conspicuously, but in the methodical background way of someone who had learned early that paying attention was less dangerous than not paying attention. He was in Vernon's study to look for a maths worksheet he'd accidentally left there the week before, on the corner of the desk when he'd been doing his homework in the one room in the house that was quiet and cool and usually empty. He had not been supposed to be in the study unsupervised then either, but it had been June, and the kitchen had smelled of Dudley's lunch, and there had been nowhere else to go. The worksheet was not on the desk. 2. He checked under it, and behind the telephone, and along the shelf of trade catalogues. He was crouching by the filing cabinet when he saw that the bottom drawer was not closed all the way. He looked at it for a moment. Vernon had left in a hurry that morning. Harry had heard him. The particular thunderous quality of Vernon's urgency on the stairs, the front door at force, the car reversing too fast down the drive. Vernon's absences ran on a schedule, and this one had not been scheduled, which was why the drawer was still open. Harry stood up and went over to it. There were 10 envelopes inside. They were stacked in a neat column, oldest on the bottom, most recent on top, ordered and precise. The paper was cream-colored and heavier than it looked, and the address on the topmost envelope was written in ink that seemed, in the dusty morning light, to be an unusual shade of green. Mr. H. Potter, 4 Privet Drive, Ive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Harry stood very still. He knew his address. But it was not written the way address labels were usually written. It was handwritten, each letter formed deliberately, in the way someone wrote when they intended the recipient to know the letter was for them specifically. He picked up the envelope. In the top left corner, where the sender's address would be Gringotts Wizarding Bank, Diagon Alley, London, he turned it over. Howliers. The back had been sealed with wax, dark green, an embossed design he couldn't make out, then resealed clumsily with a strip of sticky tape that had gone yellow at the edges. On the front of the envelope at the bottom was a narrow line where the paper was slightly indented, as though someone had pressed a pen into it. The indentation was a signature. V. Dursley. He put the envelope down and looked at the rest of the stack. He could see the signature line on each one. The visible edge of the bottom strip, the pressed-in cursive of the same name, repeated V. Dursley, V. Dursley. He did not know what Gringotts was. He did not know what a wizarding bank was, or what it might want with him, or why Vernon would have signed for envelopes addressed to someone else. He only knew, with the instinctive certainty of someone who had learned to read rooms carefully, that he should not be holding this envelope when Vernon came home. He put it back, he straightened the stack, he went to push the drawer shut. He heard the car in the drive. He came out of the study quickly and pulled the door not quite closed behind him, the way he had found it. He was in the hallway when the front door opened. Vernon looked at him. Vernon looked at the study door. The particular redness that came into Vernon's face then was not ordinary anger. It was deeper than that and more complicated, the color of a man who has been frightened before he thought to be angry and who has arrived at anger as the more manageable of the two. The punishment that followed was immediate and disproportionate, even by the standards of number 4, Privet Drive. Harry did not ask what it was for. Vernon did not explain himself. But the fact of it was enough to tell Harry what the envelopes were, not merely private, but important in a way that meant Vernon would rather have any other outcome than the outcome in which Harry had touched them. Harry spent a week trying to think of what a wizarding bank was. He turned the phrase over at night, in the dark of the cupboard, in the way he turned things over when there was nothing else to do. Wizarding sounded like wizard, which was a word that belonged in stories. Stories Vernon would have pulled off the shelf to demonstrate that there was no such thing. So wizarding was the kind of word Vernon would not want him thinking about. And bank was ordinary enough, but he did not know what kind of bank wrote in handwritten green ink on cream-colored paper and sealed the envelope with wax. He did not know why Vernon had signed for it. He did not know why Vernon had signed for 10 of them. He did not get the chance to ask. The letter came on a Tuesday, regular post, early. Harry knew it was addressed to him from the color that went into Vernon's face when Vernon sorted through the pile. Vernon pocketed it, sat back down, said nothing. More letters came. Every day after that, then twice a day, then the letter slot was sealed with packing tape that Petunia smoothed back into place with her thumb because she could not help it. Dozens of letters, then more than dozens. The address on them was precise. Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive. I've Little Winging, Surrey. Harry read this over Vernon's shoulder once, very quickly, and did not say that he had seen that kind of precise handwriting before, on cream envelopes. In a locked drawer, Vernon moved him to Dudley's second bedroom. The letters updated, the smallest bedroom. Vernon moved them to a hotel. The letters found them there. Vernon moved them to a hut on a rock in the sea, which you could only reach by boat, which smelled of mildew and had no heating. Harry lay on a stone floor in the dark, while Dudley snored on the sofa, and the wind moved across the water outside, and his 11th birthday became real in the slow accumulation of hours, because when you had nowhere to be, you always knew exactly what time it was. He was aware that he was very far from number 4, Privet Drive, and the study, and the ajar drawer. He had not been home in 2 weeks. Whatever was in those envelopes was still in the house, and he could not get at it. The question he could not yet quite shape, Gringotts, and his name, and Vernon's signature, and the word wizarding pressed into cream paper, sat in him like a splinter. Small and specific and not going anywhere. He was also aware, in the thin-walled way a person becomes aware of things in the dark and the quiet, that Vernon's terror about the letters was bigger than the letters deserved. Vernon was a man who solved things by force, by boarding up, by nailing down, by sheer bulk of will. He did not run from things that only made him angry. He ran from things that frightened him. The letters had frightened him. And not, Harry thought, only because of what was in them. In the other room, through the thin wall of the hut, Vernon was not sleeping. Harry could tell by the silence, the particular, deliberate silence, of a man lying still when stillness was an act of concentration rather than rest. He was thinking. Harry could feel the thinking through the wall, the quality of it, the specific texture of a worry that had been worn smooth by repetition. What Vernon was thinking, though Harry could not have known it, was a sequence he had been running in his head for 3 weeks with increasing urgency. If the boy went to that school, he would go to Diagon Alley. The letter said so. Supplies available at such and such shops. Diagon Alley meant Gringotts. Gringotts held the vault. And the first time someone at Gringotts brought the boy to his vault and opened it and showed him the gold, the mounds and columns and heaps, 10 years undisturbed, they would mention the statements, because that was the kind of thing a bank mentioned when a minor account holder appeared for the first time in a decade. And the boy would ask why he hadn't known. And the answer was in a locked drawer at number 4, Privet Drive, 10 envelopes, 10 signatures, V. Dursley, V. Dursley, all the way down. He had bought himself 10 years. He could feel each of them ending. Something knocked on the door. Then it knocked again. Then it knocked with such force that Vernon sat straight up in the dark. The door came off its hinges. The door came off its hinges at midnight precisely. And the man who stepped through the gap was so large that Harry's first entirely reasonable thought was that the hut had gotten smaller. He was enormous, nearly twice the height of a person, and wider in the shoulders than Harry's sense of architecture had prepared him for. He had a great tangle of black hair and a beard to match, and his face, when he turned it toward the room, was ruddy and kind and absolutely unperturbed by the fact that he had just removed a door from a stone building on a rock in the middle of the sea. He was carrying, of all things, a pink umbrella. He leaned it against the wall and looked around the hut. "Couldn't make a cup of tea, could you?" he said to no one in particular. "Long trip." Vernon had pressed himself into the corner with his shotgun. Petunia was rigid beside him, and Dudley had buried his face against her side so that only the back of his large blonde head was visible. Harry was sitting on the stone floor. He had been there when the door arrived, working out whether the thundering knock was thunder or something else, and now he sat and stared at the enormous man who was already crouching in front of the fireplace and doing something to it, with the pink umbrella that Harry could not quite follow. A fire appeared in the grate. It was a particularly good fire. The man turned around and produced a slightly squashed parcel from somewhere inside his enormous coat. He held it out. "Happy birthday, Harry." Harry looked at the parcel and then at the man and then at the parcel again. "How do you know my name?" "Rubeus Hagrid," the man said, extending one hand. It was the size of a dustbin lid, and when it enclosed Harry's hand to shake it, Harry's hand disappeared entirely. "Keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts. Course I know your name." "Everyone knows your name." He paused, and something softer moved through his expression. "Well, I suppose you don't know why yet." He hadn't expected that. Harry opened the parcel. Inside was a chocolate cake, sticky, homemade, slightly crooked, with green icing that spelled out "Happy Birthday, Harry" in letters of varying size and enthusiasm. Harry looked at it for a moment. He had not had a birthday cake before. He wasn't sure what the appropriate response was. "Thank you," he said. He meant it quite a lot. The man Hagrid settled himself on the floor with the ease of someone for whom most furniture was already the wrong size. He pulled a crumpled envelope from his coat and held it out. "This is for you as well. It's why I've come." Harry took the envelope. It was made of thick, yellowish parchment, and it was addressed in emerald green ink, Mr. H. Potter, the hut on the rock, the sea. He turned it over. The wax seal on the back was purple and bore a coat of arms, a lion, a snake, an eagle, a badger, and a large letter H. He read it twice, because the first time he wasn't sure he had understood. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He was invited. He had a place. The term would begin on September the 1st. Am I? He looked up. Is this real? Course it's real, Hagrid said. You're a wizard, Harry. Vernon made a sound from the corner. Harry did not look at him. I'm not a wizard, Harry said automatically. I don't have. He stopped, because already the word just felt wrong. He thought about the time he had ended up on the school roof when he was running from Dudley's gang, and there had been no logical explanation for how he'd gotten there. He thought about the time he'd spoken to a snake at the zoo. He thought about his hair, which he could cut in the evening and find grown back by morning, which he had always assumed was simply a malfunction of his particular biology. Your parents were a witch and wizard, Hagrid said, with the gentle steadiness of a man delivering news that is very large and also obviously true. The best sort. James Potter, your dad, good man, very good man, and your mum. He looked, briefly, as though he might cry. Well, Harry's parents had died in a car crash. Vernon had said this when Harry was old enough to ask a car crash. His father had been drunk, or the road had been icy. Vernon had varied the details slightly over the years, which Harry had noted without understanding the significance of. His parents had died in a car crash, and they had been good for nothing. And that was that. They didn't die in a car crash, Harry said. It was not a question. No, Hagrid said. They didn't. Hagrid told him everything. Then, not all at once. But in the way a man tells things he has been carrying for a long time, and is glad at last to put down. There was a dark wizard, the most dangerous in a century. There was a war. There was a night in October when the worst had happened, and there was Harry, somehow alive at the end of it, famous in a world he'd never been allowed to know about, with a lightning bolt scar on his forehead that was not, Hagrid explained apologetically, the result of the car crash. You're famous, Harry. Everyone in our world knows your name. Harry touched the scar on his forehead. He had never been told how he'd gotten it. He had asked once, when he was very small, and Vernon had looked at him in a way that had been sufficiently discouraging that he had not asked again. He had so many questions that he couldn't find where one ended and the next began. But the one that surfaced, the one that pushed through the layer of astonishment and revelation and the peculiar vertiginous sense that his entire life had been built on a surface that was not solid, was specific and small and particular. Hagrid, he said, you said there's money at a bank. Hagrid's expression went warm, in the way that people's expressions go warm when they are delivering news they think will help. Oh aye, Gringotts, the wizarding bank. Your parents left, a small fortune there, in your vault. We'll be going to Gringotts tomorrow. I've got a letter from Dumbledore authorizing the visit. He patted his coat in a way that suggested the letter was somewhere in its vast interior. Don't worry about the money, Harry. It's there. It's waiting. Harry went very still. He thought about 10 cream-colored envelopes stacked in a locked drawer. He thought about emerald green ink and a return address, Gringotts Wizarding Bank, Diagon Alley, London. He thought about Vernon's face on the Wednesday morning, the particular color of it when he had seen Harry in the hallway, the punishment that had followed. He thought about the signature line pressed into the paper of each envelope. Were there ever letters from the bank? He said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Before tonight, I mean, would the bank have written to me before? To this address, Hagrid stopped. It was a very specific kind of stopping, not the stop of a man who doesn't know, but the stop of a man who is suddenly placing something into a different context than the one he'd been using. Then, slowly, his great black brows drew together. "I don't rightly know," he said carefully. "I don't see why they would have—" He stopped again. "Why do you ask?" Harry said. "No reason." He was aware, even as he said it, that no reason was not what his face was doing. He was also aware that Hagrid was looking at him with the kind of close, concerned attention that Harry was not accustomed to, which was the attention of a person who was looking at him and seeing something worth looking at. He did not say anything more, but he looked, for the first time since midnight at the corner where the Dursleys huddled. Vernon's face was the colour of old putty. His small eyes were fixed on some point above Harry's head, and his jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck were visible. He was not going to speak. Harry understood this. He had a great deal of experience with the particular quality of Vernon Dursley's silence. The difference between the silence that was ignoring something and the silence that was holding something in. And this was the second kind. This was the silence of a man in a very small room with a very large problem, holding himself completely still, so that the problem did not look at him directly. Petunia's hands were folded in her lap. As Harry watched, her fingers tightened on each other. One small, controlled movement, the knuckles going pale, the press of her rings against her skin. She did not look at Vernon. She did not look at Harry. Harry turned back to the fire. He picked up his birthday cake from the floor beside him and looked at the green icing, uneven and cheerful, and thought about 10 envelopes and 10 signatures and a locked drawer that would still be there when he got home. He was going to Hogwarts. The world was larger than the cupboard under the stairs. His parents had been real people, good people, people who had loved him enough to die for it, and someone had been signing for his post. Hagrid? I? Can I have a piece of cake? Course you can, Hagrid said, and his voice was very gentle, and Harry thought that the gentleness was not entirely about the cake. Diagon Alley was the most overwhelming place Harry had ever been, and he had now been in it for approximately 4 minutes. The Leaky Cauldron had been strange enough, a dark, cramped pub full of people who recognized him, which was an experience he had no framework for. But that had been a passageway, not a destination. The alley itself was something else. It was narrow and crooked and teeming, stacked high on both sides with shops, whose signs announced things Harry could not quite make sense of yet. Quality Quidditch supplies, Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions, Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor. The crowd moved around him and Hagrid in a stream. Wizards and witches in robes. Children with owls on their wrists. A woman carrying what appeared to be a sack of frogs. Everything was color and noise and the smell of something Harry couldn't identify but which his brain categorized, helpfully, as magic. He stayed close to Hagrid, who was impossible to lose in a crowd on the grounds that he was approximately twice the size of everyone in it. Gringotts stood at the far end of the alley, white marble, taller than everything around it, gleaming with the particular confidence of a building that has never needed to be modest about what it contained. A set of bronze doors gave way to silver doors, which gave way to a pair of plain wooden doors, opening into a hall so long that the far end was genuinely dim. Harry's shoes clicked on the white marble floor. The hall was lined on both sides with high counters behind which goblin tellers sat on high stools, tending to the enormous ledgers and stacks of coins before them, with the focused efficiency of people who had done this for centuries and intended to go on doing it indefinitely. Hagrid led Harry to the nearest available teller. "Morning," Hagrid said. "We're here for 2 vaults. Harry Potter's vault first, then Vault 713. Dumbledore sent a letter. He fished inside his coat and produced a crumpled envelope that he smoothed slightly against his chest before handing it across the counter. The goblin took the letter. He unfolded it, read it, refolded it, and set it aside. He opened a large ledger and ran one long, pale finger down the page. "Harry James Potter," the goblin said without looking up. "First personal visit to the account." "That's right," Hagrid said. The goblin turned the ledger page. Then he turned another. His finger paused on something, and then moved on, and his face did not change. "I will need to retrieve the account file. Please wait." Harry stood and looked at the hall while the goblin stepped down from his stool and disappeared through a side door. Hagrid rocked on his heels. Harry looked at the fireplaces flanking the hall at intervals, real fires in each one, which seemed impractical for a building made entirely of marble, but which were, Hagrid assured him in a low voice, perfectly safe. The goblin returned with a thin folder and placed it on the counter. He opened it, read the first page, turned to the second, and then was still for a moment in the way that goblins are still. Not motionless exactly, but contained, all of the response happening somewhere the observer couldn't reach. "The annual correspondence to this account," the goblin said. "May I ask, the account holder has not been in contact with the bank before today?" "No," Hagrid said. "And the account holder's magical guardian has not been in contact—" "There isn't," Hagrid stopped. "Dumbledore keeps an eye on things like—" "I see," said the goblin. He closed the folder. "Your account number, and I'll arrange your cart. Are you familiar with the passage to the vaults?" Harry said he was not. The cart was a small, windowless railway carriage, and it moved through the underground passages at a speed that made Hagrid go slightly green and grip the sides with both enormous hands. Harry held on and watched the rock wall flash past, and tried to understand where in London you could put this much underground without anyone noticing. The answer, he supposed, was magic. Everything, for the moment, was answered by magic. The vault door was small and iron, set into a stone corridor deep in the rock. The goblin pressed his hand to it, and it swung open, and then Harry was standing in the doorway of his vault, and the gold was real. He had not let himself form a picture of it. He had seen the return address on the cream envelopes. He had seen his name on the outside. He had seen the signature line pressed into the paper in Vernon's compact ballpoint hand, and he had understood that the envelopes contained something important enough that Vernon had signed for a decade's worth of them rather than risk what might happen. He had not let himself think beyond that, because he had not had enough information to think usefully, and he was not by nature someone who filled in gaps with fantasies. But now, mounds of gold galleons piled to the back of the vault, columns of silver sickles, heaps of bronze nuts, a small fortune in Hagrid's words, carelessly, on the rock the night before, and what those words looked like in practice was this: more money than Harry had ever seen in his life, in any denomination, in any currency, accumulated in a stone room underground undisturbed, for 10 years. His parents had left him this. James and Lily Potter, who had died in October of 1981, for reasons Harry was still assembling into coherence, had left him this. And for 10 years it had sat here, and his address of record had received an annual accounting of it, and someone at that address had signed for every one of those accountings and had not told him. He stepped into the vault and filled his bag with galleons. He did not count them. He scooped what seemed like enough and a little more, and tied the bag shut, and then he stood in the vault for a moment longer than he needed to, because he was looking at the rest of it, at the sheer solid fact of resources he had never known he had, and thinking about the bicycle question, the one she had not answered, he thought about every pair of shoes that had belonged to Dudley first. He thought about the sleeping bag on the kitchen floor, for the night the Masons had come to dinner, and the cold draught from the gap under the cupboard door, and the particular quality of going without, that has no single dramatic incident, but is instead an accumulation of small insufficiencies across years. He picked up his bag and went back to the cart. Hagrid went on to Vault 713 with the goblin, for reasons Harry understood he was not to ask about. Harry waited in the corridor. He waited for what felt like a long time, listening to the deep silence of underground rock, thinking about records. When Hagrid returned, he was tucking something into the inside breast pocket of his coat with careful deliberateness, and his expression was the expression of a man who had been told to look casual and had not entirely succeeded. "Ready then," Hagrid said. "Hagrid," Harry said, "do goblins keep records of everything? Letters they've sent, packages, deliveries?" Hagrid blinked. "Oh, aye. They never lose nothing, goblins. Very thorough. Very particular about their records." He paused. "Why, just wondered," Harry said. Hagrid looked at him for a moment with that particular, worried attentiveness Harry was beginning to recognize, the look of a man who was adding something to a sum he was already keeping in his head. He did not press. He said, "Right then," and they got back into the cart, and the goblin drove them back through the tunnels to the marble hall. In the broad lobby, with the fireplaces crackling on either side and the tellers working at their counters, Harry said goodbye to Hagrid for the day and stepped back out into the alley. Hagrid lumbered off in the direction of the robe shop, and Harry stood for a moment in the crowd and breathed. He was not finished thinking about the vault. He thought, actually, that he had only just started. Behind the counter, in the marble hall, the goblin teller, who had handled Harry Potter's first vault access, returned to his high stool, opened the folder, and made a notation on the second page. The notation was precise and brief. First, personal access by account holder. First access audit performed. Irregularity in correspondence record identified and flagged. Formal query initiated per standard protocol for unverified Muggle correspondence receipt. No documented magical guardianship in 10-year period of annual statement transmission. He signed his name at the bottom. He closed the folder and set it in the tray for escalation review. The tray in Gringotts was emptied every morning. The query would reach the relevant senior teller by the following day, and from there it would follow its proper channels, because Gringotts had proper channels for exactly this kind of irregularity, because Gringotts maintained records of everything. The goblin teller picked up his pen and turned to the next account. The goblin arrived on a Thursday morning, which was, Dumbledore reflected, appropriate. Thursdays had never done anything particularly well. He had been at his desk since before sunrise, working through the correspondence that accumulated over summer with the patience of standing water. The window behind him showed a sky that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. He was aware of the knock at the door the moment it happened. He was always aware of knocks. Decades of headmastering had given him a sensitivity to them that bordered on the preternatural. And he said, "Come in," without looking up from the letter he was annotating. The goblin who entered was immaculately dressed, dark robes, very precisely pressed, not a crease out of order. He was carrying a narrow case of pale leather, the kind used for documents that needed to arrive undamaged, and he moved to the chair on the far side of the desk, with the unhurried certainty of someone who knows that what he is carrying gives him every right to the room he is standing in. "Headmaster," he said. "Good morning," Dumbledore said, setting down his pen. He looked at the case. He had in his long life been visited by goblin messengers on perhaps 11 occasions, and on none of those occasions had the case been good news. "Please sit." The goblin sat. He placed the case on his knees, opened the catches, and removed a folder of documents which he set on the desk in front of Dumbledore, without comment. "The Harry Potter account," the goblin said. "We are here in your capacity as the authorizing party for the account holder's first vault access, which took place on August the 3rd of this year." "I see," Dumbledore said. He looked at the folder. He did not open it yet. He had found, over the course of a very long life, that there was value in the moment before you knew a thing, the last instant in which a range of possibilities still existed, and only one of them was true. He sat with that moment for the count of a breath. Then he opened the folder. The documents were copies, neatly made. Goblin record-keeping was meticulous, and he had never expected otherwise. The first page was an account summary. Harry James Potter, Minor Vault. The vault number listed first personal visit August 1991. 10 years open. No withdrawals, no deposits in that period. Annual statements. 10 sent. 10 delivered to the address of record. 10 signed receipts returned. He turned the page. The signed receipts were photocopied onto a single sheet, arranged in chronological order. They were small things, a strip of paper, the kind that comes attached to the bottom of a formal envelope, with space for a date and a signature. 10 of them. Dates from November 1981 through to November 1990. The signature on each one was the same, neat, compact, pressed into the paper with a ballpoint pen, V. Dursley. Dumbledore looked at these for rather longer than the goblin required of him. "The account holder," the goblin said, his voice even and dry, "is Harry James Potter. The account holder's address of record is 4 Privet Drive, Ive, Little Whinging, Surrey. This is a Muggle address." He paused for the precise length of time required to let the implication settle. The signature on all 10 receipts is consistent with a Muggle handwriting. The ink, the pen type, the style. It is not the account holder's signature. The account holder was 1 year old when the first statement was delivered. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "He was." The bank's records indicate that no magical guardian was ever formally designated for this account during the minor's first decade. No wizarding authority was notified of the annual statements. No inquiry was ever received from any party acting on the minor's behalf. The goblin placed his folded hands on the desk with the precision of a man who has said what he needed to say and is now simply waiting to see what effect it produces. "We are raising this with you as the authorizing party for the account holder's visit." Dumbledore closed the folder. He had made, in the course of his life, a very large number of decisions. He thought of himself as someone who understood the weight of decisions, who knew that every arrangement had edges, and that the edges were where things fell. He had trusted the blood protection magic to hold Harry at Privet Drive, and it had held. He had trusted that the Dursleys would, however unwillingly, fulfill their basic obligations to the child, and in the narrowest physical sense they had. He had trusted that Harry's vault was simply sitting, as vaults sit, untouched and patient, waiting for the day Harry would be old enough to access it. He had not thought to ask about the paper trail. The precise nature of his failure was this. Sirius Black had been meant to take custody of Harry. Sirius was James's named guardian, Lily's endorsed choice, the obvious and intended answer to the question of what happened to Harry if the worst came to pass. When Sirius was arrested on the 1st of November 1981, On the same night, Dumbledore placed Harry at Privet Drive, a cemetery that had never brought him any comfort. The guardian structure had simply not been replaced. There had been no time. There had been the war's ending and Voldemort's disappearance and the wizarding world's chaotic, grieving relief, and in all of that, the question of who was responsible for Harry's financial affairs during his minor years had been answered by Dumbledore, not with a wrong answer, with no answer. He looked at the folder on his desk and at his own hands resting on either side of it and felt a very old feeling. The specific, cold quality of recognizing that an error has been running quietly in the background for a long time while you are occupied with other things. "Was the money ever withdrawn?" he asked. "No," the goblin said. "The vault balance is precisely what it was in November 1981. Only the statements were received." Dumbledore nodded once. The Dursleys had kept Harry's post. They had not stolen from him. They had signed for letters addressed to a 1-year-old child, read them and locked them away, and kept the secret year on year, and had not touched a single coin of the inheritance they were sitting on top of. He turned this information over in his mind and found that he could not decide whether the absence of theft made it better or worse. He thought, on balance, that it made it more precise. This was not about greed. This was about something else. The particular will of a man who wants a thing contained. Harry had been contained very thoroughly. "I will need a complete copy of the record," Dumbledore said. "All 10 statements and all 10 signed receipts. I intend to visit the address of record." "We anticipated this," the goblin said. He reached into the case and produced a second folder, which he laid on the desk beside the first. "This is your copy. The originals remain with us." "Of course," Dumbledore said. He walked the goblin to the door and bid him a pleasant morning, because he had not, in all his decades, managed to make anything better by abandoning courtesy. He closed the door and stood for a moment in the quiet of the office. Fawkes was watching him from his perch beside the window. The Phoenix's golden eyes were steady and without judgment, which Dumbledore had always considered one of the great virtues of Phoenixes. They were incapable of the particular expression humans make. When they want you to know, they are not saying, "I told you so." He crossed to his desk and sat down. He opened the second folder and looked at the 10 receipts arranged in their neat column. 10 years of Thursday mornings. It had always been Thursdays, he noticed. The bank had a consistent dispatch cycle, when Vernon Dursley had signed his name on an envelope addressed to a child who did not know his own vault existed. He thought of McGonagall on the night of November the 1st, 1981, sitting on a cold wall in the rain and telling him that the Dursleys were the worst sort of muggles, and that he should reconsider. He thought of himself explaining that Harry needed to be kept safe, and that blood was the only magic strong enough for it, and that the protection required this specific address and this specific woman, because there was no other blood in the world that carried. McGonagall had looked at him across the dark street and said she did not like it. He had been right about the blood protection. It had held for 10 years without a single failure. And he had been, in the particular way available only to very intelligent people who have trusted their own reasoning too completely, wrong about everything else. He closed the folder and went to write to Petunia Dursley. She knew it was him before she opened the door. There was no particular reason she should have known. She had not seen him since the night he had left a baby on her doorstep in the dark, and she had not expected to see him again, and she had spent a fair portion of the last 10 years arranging her life so that she would not have to. But the knock was not the knock of anyone she knew. It had a quality of absolute certainty to it, the knock of a person who has never once wondered whether they would be admitted. And Petunia Dursley had lived long enough alongside extraordinary things to know the difference between a knock that was merely confident She dried her hands on the kitchen towel and went to the door. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply forgotten what it was like to stand next to someone who occupied space the way he did. Not physically large, nothing like Hagrid, but present in a way that made the ordinary dimensions of the doorframe seem slightly beside the point. The long silver hair and beard were, as she remembered, the half-moon spectacles, the eyes behind them very blue and very steady. He was wearing deep blue robes with silver at the hem, which would have struck any of her neighbors as eccentric if any of her neighbors had been home on a Tuesday morning, which they were not. He was carrying a case. "Mrs. Dursley," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered, gentle and precise, and impossible to refuse, without feeling that the refusal was its own kind of statement. "I wonder if I might come in." She stepped back from the door. She put the kettle on because her hands needed to be doing something, and she made tea because tea was what you did when a person came to your house, regardless of how you felt about the person or the reason. And she set 2 cups on the table and sat down across from him. He thanked her for the tea. He took 1 sip. Then he set his cup down, opened the case beside his chair, and began laying papers on the kitchen table. He did it methodically, without speaking. 1 paper. He arranged them in a line across the middle of the table, and then he continued with the 2nd row. 10 pieces of paper in all. She could see, without reading them, what they were, the format of them, the paper type, the printed header, small and formal, in the top corner of each one. Gringotts, Wizarding Bank. He laid the last one down and folded his hands in his lap and looked at her. He did not reach for his tea again. "Did you know?" he said. Petunia looked at the 10 statements. She looked at Dumbledore. She looked, because she could not help it, at the bottom edge of the nearest one, where a signature was pressed into the paper in the compact hand she had lived beside for 17 years. "Yes," she said. The word cost her something. She knew it did, because she felt the expenditure of it, a specific internal giving way, like a nail pulled free of old wood. Dumbledore did not say anything immediately. He waited, in the manner of someone who has waited out far larger silences than this one. "I found the drawer in 1983, she said. He'd left it unlocked by accident. She looked at the table rather than at him. "I read them. I understood what they were." "Because of Lily," he said. "Because of Lily." She straightened her cup in its saucer. "I know what a Wizarding Bank envelope looks like. I knew from the time Lily got her letter, her first letter, from Hogwarts." She paused. "I know what a great deal of things look like. In that world, you learn when you grow up beside it." She had not said any of this aloud to anyone. She had not said it to Vernon, who did not ask. She had not said it to herself, because there were things she had learned very early that were better managed without direct examination. She had said none of it for 10 years, and now she was saying it to Albus Dumbledore in her kitchen at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning in August, and there was, she found, very little left to protect. "I had a key cut," she said. "I read them every year. The balance never changed." She looked up. "We never took anything." Vernon understood. He understood that taking the money would make it something different. "We kept them, we signed for them, we didn't steal." "No," Dumbledore agreed. His voice was very quiet. "You didn't." He said it without absolution. She noticed that. He said it the way you say a fact, as the thing it was, no larger and no smaller. "She died," Petunia said. She had not meant to say it. It was not a revelation. It was not news. It was the oldest fact in the room, and the one she never said. She heard herself say it, and then sat with the sound of it in the kitchen air. "Lily died," she said, again, as though the second time might clarify something the first hadn't. And the boy has her eyes, the exact same eyes. She pressed her thumb against the handle of her teacup. I wrote you a letter once. When I was 12, I asked if I could come to Hogwarts as well. Dumbledore was very still. You wrote back, she said. You were very kind about it. You said there was no place for people without the gift. She exhaled briefly through her nose. I burned your letter in the garden. I never told Lily. I became... She stopped. She did not have a good word for what she had become, or if she did, it was not a word she wanted to use about herself in front of another person. I didn't understand, she said instead, why it would give everything to her and nothing to me. Dumbledore removed his spectacles and cleaned them on his robe, once carefully, and replaced them. It was a small human gesture, and she registered it without being comforted by it. And when she died, Petunia said, they gave me him, her son, with her eyes. She looked at the 10 statements on the table. I know it was wrong not to tell him. I knew it then. But I couldn't. She stopped again, because this was the part she had never let herself finish, not even in the privacy of her own thoughts. Every time I looked at him, I saw her, and I couldn't stand it. And because I didn't look, She made a very small gesture at the table, at the 10 statements, at the whole of it. The kitchen was quiet. Upstairs, she was aware of the boy. Harry, moving around in Dudley's second bedroom, doing whatever he was doing in preparation for September. She had bought him a school trunk. Vernon had not commented on the school trunk. Some concessions had been made in the last month that neither of them had named. She heard the car before Vernon did. She always heard it before he did, because she knew its engine. The front door opened. She heard Vernon in the hall, heard him set his briefcase down. He was home early, an afternoon meeting cancelled. He had mentioned it over breakfast. And then she heard the specific quality of silence that meant he had registered something in the house that he had not expected. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. His face went from the ordinary color of a Tuesday afternoon to the dark beet red that she associated with the letters, with the boy, with anything he had not controlled. And then, as he looked from her to the man at the table to the papers spread across it to the signature on each one, Dursley, V. Dursley, all the way down, the red went out of him entirely and was replaced by a color she had no precise name for. He did not look at Petunia, he looked at the table. Dumbledore turned to Vernon. He did not stand, and he did not raise his voice, and his expression was the expression of a man who is prepared to wait for as long as necessary, which Petunia knew, and which Vernon appeared to be understanding for the first time. The silence in the kitchen was the longest Vernon Dursley had ever endured. She picked up her teacup. She took a sip. She set it down. She did not say anything. There was nothing left, she thought, that she needed to say. The room beneath Gringotts that was used for formal proceedings was not a room that ordinary customers ever saw. It was deeper than the vault levels, reached by a different corridor, entirely stone-paneled, low-ceilinged, lit by torches rather than the chandelier light of the public hall above. A long table ran the length of it, dark wood, very old, polished to a depth that made the torchlight look like it was coming from somewhere inside the surface rather than being reflected from it. 6 chairs on one side, 3 on the other. The goblin who had been assigned to present the case was already seated when Dumbledore arrived, a folder open in front of him and a glass of water at his elbow that he had not touched. Cornelius Fudge arrived 4 minutes after Dumbledore, which was the pattern of a man who had decided that being precisely late demonstrated authority rather than the reverse. He was the Minister for Magic and had been since 1990, and he entered the room with the particular energy of someone who has been told This meeting is important and has already begun composing reasons why it might be less important than that." He sat down across from the goblin, adjusted the set of his robes, and looked at the folder with the expression of a man prepared to be reasonable. Dumbledore sat to Fudge's left in the chair closest to the wall. He had brought nothing. He did not need to. The goblin waited until everyone was settled. Then he opened the folder to the first page and placed a single sheet on the table between them. "The Harry Potter account," he said. "Gringotts' account, first accessed by the account holder on the 3rd of August 1991. The account holder is Harry James Potter, born the 31st of July 1980, a minor wizard." He placed a second sheet alongside the first. "The account has been opened since the autumn of 1981. It was established in the account holder's name following the deaths of his parents, James and Lily Potter, in October of that year." He paused for the precise length of time required to let the fact of those deaths occupy the room, and then he continued. "During the period between November 1981 and November 1990, Gringotts dispatched 10 annual statements to the account holder's address of record. 4 Privet Drive Ive, Little Whinging, Surrey." He placed a third sheet on the table, 10 rows. Dates, 1 per year. Each statement was delivered. Each was acknowledged by a signature on the receipt strip. The signatures were returned to Gringotts via the established correspondence channel. He set a fourth sheet on the table. "These are copies of all 10 receipt strips. The originals are retained in our records, as they will be in perpetuity." Fudge leaned forward and looked at the receipt strips. His expression had shifted slightly from prepared to be reasonable to something harder to categorize. "V. Dursley," the goblin said. "The signature on each receipt is the same. A muggle named Vernon Dursley resides at the address of record. He is the husband of Petunia Dursley, née Evans, who is the sister of the account holder's deceased mother and the account holder's legal guardian in the muggle world." He let this sit for a moment. "The account holder, Harry James Potter, a minor wizard, did not sign any of these receipts. There is no record of the account holder having had any contact with Gringotts or any awareness of his account prior to the 3rd of August of this year." He placed 2 further sheets on the table. "The account balance, as of today, is precisely what it was in November 1981. No withdrawals have been made. No deposits have been made. The vault has been accessed once in its operational history, the 3rd of August 1991, by the account holder, in accordance with a letter of authorization from Albus Dumbledore." He folded his hands on top of the folder. "The bank sent the statements in good faith as standard practice for accounts of this type. They were received and acknowledged. The account holder did not receive them. No designated magical guardian was ever registered with the bank for this account. These are Gringotts' records. They are not in dispute." Fudge cleared his throat. He had the manner of a man who is searching for a door in a wall that does not have one, but is committed to maintaining the impression that there is probably a door. "Well," he said, "yes, a muggle signed for letters. Muggles do that. Sign for things, without necessarily understanding what they're signing for. Post arrives. You sign. That's perfectly ordinary. It's quite possible this Vernon Dursley simply didn't. Minister." The goblin's voice was not raised. It did not need to be. The statements were addressed, specifically and by name, to Mr. Harry James Potter. The address included the annotation that the account holder was a minor. The correspondence was issued by Gringotts Wizarding Bank. It is not possible to receive, sign for, open, read, and retain a document of this nature for a period of 10 years without understanding its subject. He turned a page in the folder. Furthermore, the statements were not delivered to Mr. Dursley. They were delivered to Mr. Potter, at Mr. Potter's address of record. A Muggle citizen acknowledged receipt on behalf of a minor wizard without any designation of guardianship authority. This is not a Muggle matter, it is a Gringotts matter. We are making it a ministry matter as a courtesy. Fudge opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was looking at the 10 receipt strips on the table, arranged in their neat column. He looked at them for a moment, and then he looked up. "I placed Harry with the Dursleys," he said. He said it evenly, as a man states a fact he intends to stand behind regardless of what it costs him. On the 1st of November 1981, I left him on the doorstep at 4 Privet Drive. I left a letter. I chose that household specifically because Petunia Dursley is the last living blood relative on Lily Potter's side, and the blood protection magic that Lily's death invoked requires Harry to live with that blood to maintain its effect. He paused. I did not arrange for a magical guardian for Harry's vault, or his wizarding affairs generally, during his minor years. "Who should have?" Fudge began. "Sirius Black," Dumbledore said. "James Potter's best friend, and Harry's named godfather. He would have been the natural and appropriate choice for guardianship, financial and otherwise. He was arrested on the 1st of November 1981. The same night, I placed Harry at Privet Drive. He was sent to Azkaban without trial. He set his hands flat on the table. I did not designate anyone in his place. I believed." He stopped briefly. "I believed the vault was simply waiting. As I expected Harry to find it when he was ready, I did not consider what it meant, that the bank would send correspondence to his address in the meantime. The gap was real, the gap was mine. The room was quiet for a moment. Fudge shifted in his chair. "Now, I don't think we need to go placing blame on—" "I am not placing blame. I am stating facts, as the goblins have done. The facts exist, whether or not we find them comfortable." He turned to the goblin. "What does Gringotts require from us?" The goblin looked at him with the expression goblins use when they are evaluating whether a human has just demonstrated basic competence. The expression was not warm, but it was something. "The bank requires acknowledgement from the relevant wizarding authority that the irregularity in the correspondence record has been identified and is being addressed." The goblin said, "Gringotts does not pursue matters of wizarding law. That is the ministry's domain. We require only that our records be resolved, that it is formally noted who received the correspondence, that the account holder was not the recipient, and that appropriate steps are being taken under wizarding law. The ministry will open a formal investigation," Dumbledore said. He did not look at Fudge when he said it. There was a pause. Fudge understood in the way that people in positions of authority sometimes understand things they have been trying not to, that the options before him were considerably fewer than he had supposed when he walked into the room. "Yes," Fudge said. "Yes, the ministry will open a formal investigation." He straightened his robes. "Naturally. The account holder," the goblin said, "is entitled, as a matter of bank policy, to a full copy of his correspondence record, including all 10 statements and all 10 signed receipts. He is 11 years old. He is legally entitled to receive official documentation pertaining to his own account." He assembled a sealed folder from the papers before him and set it on the table. "This is his copy. We ask that it be delivered to him." Dumbledore picked it up and placed it in the inside pocket of his robes. "I will tell him," he said. He stood. The goblin closed his folder with the finality of a matter that has been properly concluded. Fudge stood as well and looked at the table and at the copy of the 10 receipt strips still lying between them. and at the compact, even signature that ran down the column of them like a signature on a contract. He had nothing to add, and for once he said nothing. Dumbledore walked back through the stone corridor toward the marble hall, carrying the folder with Harry Potter's name on the tab, thinking about a boy he owed a great deal and had very little time left to begin repaying. But how completely the people responsible for preventing it had failed to do so. He had done harder things. He could not, at the moment, recall any. The room Dumbledore had arranged was small and private, above the leaky cauldron, with a window that looked out over the back alley and a table with 4 chairs that had the quality of furniture that had been there for a very long time and expected to go on being there indefinitely. Harry sat in one of the chairs and put his bag on the floor beside him and looked at the 10 envelopes laid in a row down the middle of the table. He had known they existed. He had seen them on the Wednesday morning in July, in Vernon's study, a jar drawer, green ink on cream paper. He had held one of them. He had seen his name on it. He had put it back. He was still wearing the jumper he'd had since year 4, which had once belonged to Dudley, and which fit Dudley very well, and him not at all. Too wide in the shoulders, too long in the sleeves, stretched at the collar. He had other clothes now. He had bought them in Diagon Alley with his own galleons, and they were his, and they were the right size, and they were in his school trunk, which was at the leaky cauldron, along with the rest of his things, while he sat in this chair and looked at the envelopes. He had put the jumper on this morning without thinking about it, the way you reach for the familiar thing when you expect a difficult day. Dumbledore sat across from him and waited until Harry was done looking, and then he said, "I'll explain what they are, if I may." "I know what they are," Harry said. "I think." He looked up. "They're from a bank." "Yes, from Gringotts. Annual statements for your account." Dumbledore rested his hands on the table. "Each year, beginning in November 1981, the bank sent one of these to your address at Privet Drive. They were addressed to you. Each year before they reached you, they were intercepted. Vernon signed for them." "Yes." "I saw." Harry looked at the row of envelopes. "In July, I found the drawer. There were 10 of them. I could see the signature line on the outside of each one." He paused. He came home early. Dumbledore said nothing, and Harry understood that the nothing was not emptiness, but space, room for whatever Harry needed to say, held open deliberately. He had noticed this about Dumbledore over the few conversations they'd had. He didn't fill silence the way most adults filled silence. "What's in them?" Harry asked. "An accounting of your vault. Your parents left you a sum of money when they died, mounds of gold galleons, columns of silver, heaps of bronze. It has been in your vault at Gringotts since October 1981. These statements record its existence each year and confirm that it is still there." He paused. "It is still there. Nothing was ever withdrawn." Harry looked at the table. He was doing, without quite meaning to, the thing he always did when he was given information that he needed to place in relation to other information he already had. The quiet interior reorganization, fitting the new thing against the existing structure of what he knew, finding where it belonged and what it changed. He had done this about magic in August. He had done it about his parents. He was doing it now. His parents had died in October 1981. He had been 1 year old. Since November of that year, the bank had been sending him a letter every autumn to tell him that his inheritance was intact and waiting for him. These letters had arrived at his house, at his address. The first of them had arrived when he was 1 year and 3 or 4 months old, and unable to read, and Vernon had signed for it, and the ones after that had come when he was 2 and 3 and 4 and so on, and Vernon had signed for all of them and locked them in the bottom drawer of his desk, and not told Harry. He reached out and picked up the nearest envelope. The cream paper was heavier than it looked. The way it had been in July, the ink had not faded. The address was still clear, each letter precisely formed. Mr. H. Potter, 4 Privet Drive, Ive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He turned it over. The wax had been broken and resealed. He looked at the signature strip on the front. V. Dursley. He knew this handwriting. He had seen it on the forms at school, the permission slip forms that teachers sent home and that came back signed, the attendance forms that said he had no one to call in an emergency, and then the name in the box, Vernon Dursley, Guardian, the pen pressed hard into the page in that same compact, decided hand. The forms that said his parent had died in a car accident, and there was nothing more to know. He put the envelope back down. Did he need to? Harry asked. He hadn't planned the question. It was just the one that was there, and it seemed like the correct one. Did he need the money? Is that why? Dumbledore's expression was careful and honest in equal measure. No, he said. The vault has never been accessed. Not once, in 10 years. Whatever Mr. Dursley's reasons, they did not include wanting your parents' money. Harry looked at the table. He thought about the cupboard under the stairs. He knew exactly what it looked like, the exact dimensions of it, the lowest shelf where his blanket folded, the smell of dust and the cold draught from the gap at the bottom of the door when it was winter, and someone had left the hall window open. He had lived in it for 10 years. He had understood the cupboard to be simply the way his life was, one of the many ways in which his situation differed from Dudley's, and he had not, when he was very small, understood that it was unusual, because he had no other life to compare it to. He had understood, as he got older, that it was not a kindness, but he had also understood it as something impersonal, the way weather is impersonal, not directed at you specifically, but simply what was. He understood now that it was directed at him specifically, not because Vernon wanted to take anything from him, because Vernon wanted him not to know he had anything, not to know he could leave, if leaving had been an option. Not to know there was a number on a vault door with his name attached to it. Not to know that his parents had left him something, that they had been real people who had thought about his future and provided for it, that there was a paper record of that future sitting in a bank's stone corridors 10 years before he was old enough to claim it. The specific cruelty of this was very hard to find a word for. Harry tried. He was not able to. He was 11 years old, and he was sitting in a room above the leaky cauldron in a jumper that didn't fit, and the thing he was trying to name was not something he had the vocabulary for yet, and he was not sure he was going to find it today. He looked at the 10 envelopes. He looked at them for a long time. Then he said, "Can I keep them?" Dumbledore said, "They have always belonged to you." Harry pulled the envelopes toward him, one at a time, and stacked them neatly, oldest to newest, the way they had been in the drawer. He thought about that, the way they had been ordered in the drawer, neatly stacked, cared for, and then he thought about something else, and stopped thinking about it. He put the stack of envelopes in his bag, under the book he'd brought from Diagon Alley, so they wouldn't get bent in transit. He sat back in the chair. Dumbledore did not say that everything was going to be all right. Harry was aware of this, and appreciated it in the specific way you appreciate a thing. When the alternative would have been substantially worse, he did not want to be told it was all right. It was not all right, he was clear on that. It had not been all right for 10 years, and the fact that he now knew about it did not make the 10 years retroactively better. It made them, in some ways, more specifically what they were. He did not say thank you when he stood up. Dumbledore did not ask him to. He picked up his bag, with the envelopes in it and the book on top of them, and he opened the door to the narrow staircase, and he went downstairs to where his school trunk was, and he thought about September the 1st, and the train, and the fact that he had a vault full of gold that had been waiting for him for 10 years. And that, when he had bought his robes and his cauldron and his books and his wand, he had paid for them himself out of his own gold, and that was what his parents' money had always been meant for. He thought about the jumper. He thought about how he had put it on this morning without thinking, and how he was going to take it off when he got upstairs and fold it and leave it on the bed, and not take it with him on the 1st of September, because he had other clothes now, clothes that fit. And there was no reason in the world to carry something with him that he had never wanted in the first place. She had kept the notes because she kept everything. This was simply the kind of person Minerva McGonagall was. Methodical, thorough, possessed of an institutional memory that her colleagues sometimes found comforting and sometimes found inconvenient, depending on whether they were the sort of person who wanted things to be remembered. She had a filing system that went back to the beginning of her time at Hogwarts, and within it, in a folder she had labeled simply November 1981, was a single piece of parchment covered in her own handwriting, date, location, observations, professional assessment. She carried it to the headmaster's office on the 3rd of September. She did not knock loudly. She knocked with the precise force of a person who is not uncertain about whether they will be admitted. The door opened, and she went in, and she placed the parchment on the desk in front of Dumbledore without preamble. He looked at it. He looked at her. She sat down in the chair across from him and folded her hands in her lap, and waited. He read the notes. It did not take long. They were 1 page, and she did not waste words. She watched his face while he read, because she believed in watching people's faces when they read things that concerned them. It was the most efficient diagnostic available. His face did not change dramatically. He was too old and too experienced for dramatic facial responses to most things, and she respected this in him when she was not frustrated by it. He read to the end. He set the parchment down. "I know you do," McGonagall said. "I am not here to establish that you remember it. I am here because I wrote down what I saw and what I said to you and what you said to me, and I have kept those notes for 10 years, and I believe they are relevant now." "They are?" he said. "I told you they were the worst sort of muggles," she said. "I watched them all day. The husband came home and laughed at a neighbor's misfortune, and then spent the evening closing his curtains against the owls. The wife cleaned the windows twice and refused to make eye contact with her son's pram when it was in the garden. I did not see the inside of the house, but what I could see was sufficient. I told you it was not right. I told you there were other options. You did. And you told me that Lily's protection required Petunia specifically. That blood was the mechanism, and Petunia was the only blood. That Harry must live in her house for the protection to hold." She paused. "I did not push further. I accepted your reasoning, because the reasoning was sound, and because I trusted that you had considered the welfare question adequately." Dumbledore said, "I had not." The honesty of it landed without drama, which was the most Dumbledore thing he could have done, to make the admission entirely without self-pity or self-defense, as though he were reporting a fact about the weather. McGonagall had, over many years, developed a complicated appreciation for this quality in him. It made him trustworthy, and it made him, in certain situations, very difficult to argue with, because there was nothing left to argue against. "No," she said, "you had not." She was not going to say, "I told you so." She had considered it during the previous week and decided against it, not because she lacked the instinct, but because the instinct was beside the point. She had been right, and that was already recorded in the parchment on the desk, and making him hear it a second time would not change what 10 years had cost the boy. She was more interested in the next 10. "What can be done?" she asked. "Can he be removed from Privet Drive entirely?" Dumbledore's hands were flat on the desk, resting on either side of the parchment. "No," he said, "not permanently. The blood protection charm requires Harry to return to that house, to treat it as home in the magical sense. At least once a year, the charm holds until his 17th birthday. If he does not return, the protection breaks. And Voldemort, whatever state he is currently in, has not been destroyed. He's a wraith in a forest somewhere. At present, we do not know what state somewhere he's currently in, and we do not know what resources he still has, or what allies, or how long the somewhere will remain sufficient." He met her eyes. "The protection on Harry is the most powerful magic Lily could have invoked. I will not be responsible for breaking it." McGonagall was quiet for a moment. She understood the argument. She had always understood the argument. It was, as arguments went, an extremely good one, which was part of what had silenced her in 1981 and what made silence so difficult to justify in retrospect. Voldemort was not finished. The blood magic worked specifically because Petunia had taken Harry in with full knowledge of what he was, and that knowledge was what powered the charm, and there was no equivalent alternative in the world. The problem, and the thing she had not adequately pressed him on in 1981, was that holding the charm and providing a home were not the same requirement, and Dumbledore had treated them as though they were. "You assumed," she said, "that because the magic required Petunia to take him in willingly, she would take him in adequately." "I did," he said. "That assumption was wrong." She looked at the parchment on the desk. At her own handwriting, 10 years old, the neat rows of observation, the final assessment, not a suitable environment for a child of this significance or any other significance. She thought about the fact that she had written that sentence and filed it and gone back to her work and never followed up because the headmaster had made his decision, and the headmaster was a man whose decisions she had trusted for 20 years. "What can you offer?" she said, concretely. "Not intentions. What can actually be done?" Dumbledore was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was being honest about the limits of his answer, rather than searching for better phrasing. "Mrs. Figg," he said, "Arabella Figg, the squib I placed near Privet Drive to watch over him. I have been receiving her reports annually. I will ask her to send them weekly, monthly, at minimum." He paused. "It should have been monthly from the beginning. That is a failure I am correcting now, not one. I am asking credit for correcting." "Good," McGonagall said. "Harry's school supplies have already been purchased with his own vault money, not any ministry or school fund. That will continue. All expenses related to his education should be drawn from his own account. He is 11. He is entitled to understand his own finances. He looked at the parchment. The 10 statements have been returned to him. He has them. He knows what they are. And the summers," she said. "He must return there," Dumbledore said, "each summer for at least a period. I cannot change that. What I can change is what I know about what happens when he is there, and whether anyone in the wizarding world is paying adequate attention." He paused. "I was not paying adequate attention. I understand that now. In a way—" McGonagall looked at him for a moment. There were, she thought, 2 ways to respond to Albus Dumbledore when he said something like that. One was to accept it as sufficient and move on, which was what most people did, because he said it so completely that it seemed to fill the space where an argument might otherwise go. The other was to hold it in place and let it be exactly what it was, an acknowledgement, not an absolution, and require it to be followed by something. "Weekly reports from Mrs. Figg," she said. "Vault access for Harry's expenses with his knowledge. And you will tell me, in future, if anything gives you cause for concern regarding his welfare. Not Hagrid. Me. Yes, he said. That will have to be enough, then. She stood. She picked up her parchment from the desk. She did not return it to the folder. She stood holding it for a moment, and then, quite deliberately, she set it back down on the desk in front of him. Keep it, she said. You should have the record. She walked to the door. She did not look back, because she had said what she had come to say, and she did not add to things unnecessarily when they were already complete. Behind her, she heard the particular quality of silence that was Dumbledore sitting with something he could not give back. She went to prepare for the term. They arrived on a Wednesday morning, 2 of them in dark robes, carrying a case with the ministry's seal pressed into the leather of its clasp. Vernon answered the door because Petunia had gone to Dudley's room, and he was wearing his work clothes, but had not yet left for Grunnings, because the meeting that was supposed to require his presence at 8 o'clock had been cancelled the previous evening, and he had been sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold when the knock came. He let them in. He did not know what else to do. They were polite, which was somehow worse than if they had not been. They introduced themselves. Officers from the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office, part of the Ministry of Magic, here to collect the original documents pertaining to the Harry Potter account. One of them, a thin, balding man with horn-rimmed spectacles and the kind of expression that suggested he had chosen this line of work because he found people genuinely interesting, spoke while the other held the case open on the kitchen table. The thin man had a manner that was neither hostile nor sympathetic, but simply practical. He had a thing to do, and he intended to do it, and he was prepared to be pleasant about the process. Vernon walked them to the study. He opened the bottom drawer of the desk. He stood back. The thin man crouched to look at the drawer, then reached in and lifted the envelopes out one at a time, holding each one by its edges, and placed them into the case the other officer was holding. He had never counted them as they went out. He had counted them when they went in, once a year, adding to the total in his own internal accounting, but watching them leave was different, and the difference was not something he had anticipated. 4, 5, 6. He had held these for so long that the fact of them had become ordinary, not something he looked at anymore, but something he knew was there, the way you know the walls of a room without looking at them. 10. The thin man straightened up. He had put on white cotton gloves to handle the envelopes, which Vernon found irrationally infuriating. "Thank you, Mr. Dursley," he said. "We may need to follow up with you as the formal inquiry proceeds. You'll receive correspondence through standard channels." Vernon said nothing. "We'll see ourselves out," the thin man said. He did. Vernon stood in his study and looked at the open drawer. It was a wooden drawer, approximately 40 centimeters wide and 20 centimeters deep. It had a small brass lock, which he had not locked this morning because it had seemed, by this point, beside the point, inside nothing. The drawer was clean because Petunia kept all surfaces clean, including this one, on the understanding that clean meant managed, and managed meant nothing had been left to accumulate. There were no dust marks where the envelopes had been. There was no shadow of them. It was simply an empty drawer. He stood looking at it for quite a long time. The formal finding, which would be delivered to him in the subsequent weeks in language chosen for its precision rather than its comfort, was this: a Muggle adult had knowingly intercepted wizarding financial documents addressed to a minor wizard in his household, and taken no action to ensure their contents reached the intended recipient. The documents had not been destroyed. No financial fraud had occurred. The vault balance was unaltered. This placed the matter in a legal area that was, to use the phrase the ministry's correspondents would use, insufficiently addressed by either Muggle or wizarding statute. An investigation had been opened. He was advised to seek counsel if he wished. There was, The letter would note, "No clean provision under wizarding law for the prosecution of a muggle who had retained correspondence without financial gain." There was equally no clean provision under muggle law for a situation involving wizarding documents. What there was, instead, was a complete and verified record. 10 statements, 10 signed receipts, a decade of V. Dursley, pressed into cream paper, in ballpoint ink, irrefutably documented. Vernon had not stolen anything. He had known this, and he had told himself so, at regular intervals across 10 years, and the telling had performed its function so reliably that he had stopped being fully aware of the performance. He had not stolen. He had held. He had signed for letters addressed to someone else, in his own house, at his own address, and he had not told the someone else, but that was not stealing. Stealing was taking. He had not taken. He kept that. Harry did not know his parents left him something. He kept that, Harry did not know the world considered him important. He kept Harry in a cupboard under the stairs for 10 years, and he had known every November when the envelope came that what was in that envelope was the answer to the question Harry would have asked if Harry had been allowed to ask questions, which was, "Why should I accept this? Why is this what I am? What is preventing me from leaving?" "Nothing," the envelope would have said. "There was never anything preventing you. Here is the evidence. Here is the gold. Here is your name on the account, and here is your future, and you have always had both." He had kept that. In the kitchen, the sound of the tap running. Petunia was washing the breakfast dishes. She had not come to the study when the ministry men arrived. She had not come to the door when they knocked. He heard the water in the pipes, and the small domestic sounds of plates being stacked, and then the silence that meant she was done, and waiting, and not coming to find him. They had not spoken properly since Dumbledore had sat at the kitchen table with 10 pieces of paper and asked her a question she had answered honestly. Vernon had not asked her not to answer it. He had not had time. He thought, if he had been asked in the years before this week whether Petunia would tell the truth to Dumbledore, he would have said yes, without hesitation. Not because she owed Dumbledore truth, but because Petunia was not a woman who lied about the large things. She managed the small ones, the large ones, she let be what they were when there was nothing else to do. They had nothing left to manage together now. Vernon closed the drawer. Somewhere in the wizarding world, in a rented room above a muggle pub, in the kind of neighborhood where no one looked at the new tenant closely enough to notice the particular quality of his exhaustion, Remus Lupin sat at a small table and read the account of the investigation. Things Through Walls. He read it twice. He put the letter down and sat with the window at his back and the afternoon coming in grey and ordinary around him. He was 31 years old, and he had no legal standing in relation to Harry Potter, and he had known this since the night James and Lily died, had understood it with the specific procedural clarity of a man who has been classified and documented and knows exactly what the classification costs him. He could not petition the ministry on Harry's behalf. He could not demand access or information or accountability. He could not do anything that required him to present himself as a responsible party, because the ministry's view of what he was did not include the category of responsible party. He pulled a piece of parchment toward him. He picked up a quill. He wrote, "Is Harry all right?" He stopped. He dipped the quill again. He wrote James would have, and then he stopped and looked at what he had written and crossed it through with 3 careful lines until the words were fully covered. He wrote, below the crossed-out line, "I should have pushed harder." He folded the parchment. He addressed it to Dumbledore. He sealed it. He did not think Dumbledore would reply, and Dumbledore did not reply, but that was not why he had sent it. He had sent it because there were things that needed to be said somewhere, even if only into the particular silence of Albus Dumbledore's correspondence, and because James's son was 11 years old and had just found out that the world had been keeping records on him for a decade without his knowledge, and Remus Lupin was the last loyal marauder. And he had no power and no standing, and 3 sentences was what he had. He set the sealed letter on the windowsill for the owl he would hire from the post office 2 streets over, because he could not afford a bird of his own. Then he sat back down and looked at his hands. At Privet Drive, Vernon Dursley closed the drawer of his desk and stood in the quiet of his study. And the study was very orderly, and the drawer was very empty, and there was nothing left to keep. The barrier between platforms 9 and 10 was a solid wall of brick, and Harry walked at it without slowing down because that was what Hagrid had told him to do, and he had found, over the last month, that acting on good information was considerably more effective than waiting to be certain. He was through. Platform 9 3/4 was everything the school list had implied it would be, and the school list had implied quite a lot. The Hogwarts Express stood at the platform in a column of steam, scarlet engine gleaming even under the grey London morning, and the platform around it moved with families and trunks and owls in cages and children in the first robes Harry had ever seen worn as ordinary clothes. The noise was substantial. The steam was warm where it rolled across the platform in slow drifts. Harry stood for a moment in the middle of it and breathed. He was wearing a jumper that fit him at the shoulders. This was still slightly remarkable to him, and probably always would be, in the particular way that things you have always wanted and finally have remained faintly astonishing for longer than you expect. He had bought it in Diagon Alley with gold from his own vault, along with the rest of his school clothes and his robes, and the trunk now loaded onto the train by 2 older boys who had noticed him struggling and simply taken it from him without asking, which was, he was. A thing that people sometimes did when you were 11 and small and your trunk was large. He had his bag over one shoulder. Hedwig's cage was in his hand. She was a white shape in the steam, perfectly still, watching everything with the calm superiority that was apparently standard for snowy owls. He got on the train. The corridor was busy, children moving between compartments, someone's toad being called for at intervals by a girl who appeared to be doing a systematic sweep of the entire train, and Harry moved through it and found an empty compartment near the middle and slid the door shut behind him. He put Hedwig's cage on the rack. He sat down. He put his bag in his lap. He opened it. The 10 envelopes were under his copy of the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1, which he had already read, because he had read everything he bought, because he had understood from the moment Hagrid told him about Hogwarts that he was going to a school where he would be expected to know things. And he had been in a situation all his life where knowing things was his primary available advantage, and he saw no reason to stop. Now he lifted the book out and set it beside him and took out the envelopes and held them. They were worn at the edges. The cream paper was still heavy and good. It was the kind of paper that lasted, but the corners were soft and the edges were slightly compressed. From handling, he knew whose handling mostly. He had thought when he first took them that touching them would feel like touching something that had been contaminated. He had found, instead, that they felt like what they were, paper, his paper. His name on every one of them, in deliberate emerald green ink. He took out the first one, November 1981. He unfolded it carefully, along the crease lines that were not his. The letterhead, Gringotts Wizarding Bank, in engraved script at the top of the page, the date, the salutation, Dear Mr. Potter. He was 1 year old when this letter was sent. He had been at 4 Privet Drive, Ive, for less than a month. He had no memory of that time and no way to construct one. And yet here was proof of it. Here was the wizarding world writing to him, in good faith, in his name, at his address, because his parents had left him something and the institution that held it was doing its institutional duty. There was a vault in his name. There had been a vault in his name for as long as he could remember, and considerably longer. He read the account description. The qualitative language of it, mounds, columns, heaps, which he now knew was accurate, because he had stood in the vault and seen it. He read the account holder line, Harry James Potter, minor. He looked at the signature strip at the bottom of the page. V. Dursley. He had looked at this signature many times now across different contexts, on school forms, on the Hogwarts barrier to buy his ticket, on the drawer in the study in the moment before Vernon had come home early. He knew this handwriting the way he knew Vernon's voice, as a fact of his life permanent and surrounding, requiring management rather than examination. But here, in this context, pressed into the bottom of a letter addressed to him, a letter that had been sent, opened, read, and retained for 10 years before he ever saw it. It looked different, not larger, more specific. He thought about his father. He did not know what James Potter had looked like. Not exactly. Hagrid had described him, and Hagrid's descriptions were warm but impressionistic, more feeling than detail. He knew his father had had dark hair that wouldn't lie flat and hazel eyes and had been tall. He knew these things because they were the things he had not inherited, and their absence in his face was a kind of negative portrait. He had his mother's eyes. He knew this, too, though he had never seen a photograph. The Dursleys had not kept photographs of Lily Evans Potter for the same reason they had not kept the envelopes. The green of his own eyes when he caught himself in a mirror was, apparently, exactly his mother's shade. He tried to picture them. A woman with dark red hair and green eyes and a man with untidy black hair and hazel eyes, who had gone to Godric's Hollow and who had loved each other and who had loved him, evidently, in the specific and practical way that people who are going to die for something love it. They had arranged for the future. They had left money. They had thought, he will need this. Here is where it will be. Here is the institution that will hold it until he is old enough to claim it. They could not have known about the drawer. Nobody could have known about the drawer, because the drawer did not exist in November 1981. It became the drawer because Vernon made it so, one Wednesday morning when the first cream-colored envelope arrived, and he made a calculation. He refolded the letter along its crease lines and placed it carefully at the back of the stack and put the stack back in his bag under the book, the way he had carried them for the last several days. He would not lose them. He had never lost anything that mattered to him, not because he was careful by disposition he was, but that was not the primary reason, but because he had so few things that mattered to him that it was not a difficult inventory to maintain. The train had begun to move. He had not noticed it starting, which surprised him. He had expected to feel it, the jolt of departure, but it had begun so smoothly that it was already in motion when he registered the platform sliding past the window, London moving backward in grey increments, the station, the backs of buildings, the first glimpse of sky between them. The compartment door opened. A boy appeared in the doorway, tall and thin, with red hair and a long nose and a spattering of freckles across his face. He was wearing robes that were a little short at the ankle, and he had a fat, grey rat asleep in his coat pocket. And he looked into the compartment with the expression of someone who has walked the length of a train and found very few options.
"Is it all right?"
He started. "Yes," Harry said. The boy came in and slid the door shut and sat down across from him. He looked at Harry. Harry looked at him. The rat in the boy's pocket did not look at anything. "I'm Ron," the boy said. "Ron Weasley, Harry Potter." Ron's eyes went to his forehead, and then, with an evident effort of politeness, back to his face. Harry had been receiving this sequence for the last month and had become accustomed to it, though he was not sure he would ever stop noticing it. He understood that the scar meant something to people, something large and significant, but it meant less to him than the envelopes in his bag did, which was one of the many ways in which his relationship to his own history was still, as Dumbledore might have said, in formation. "I've got 6 brothers," Ron said, in the slightly defensive tone of someone getting ahead of a topic. "I know it seems like a lot." "It does," Harry agreed. "What's your rat's name?" "Scabbers. He's rubbish, to be honest. He's been in the family for years, and he's never done a single useful thing." He regarded Scabbers with the affection of someone who had long ago made peace with being disappointed. "Still, he's mine." The train moved north through the grey of the morning. The grey became green as London became the outskirts of it, and the outskirts became open country. The two of them talked, not about anything important, about Quidditch and chocolate and the school, about what the houses were like and whether the food was good. And Harry listened and talked in equal measure, which was, he was finding, the proportion that worked best, and which he had not always been free to use. His bag sat on the seat beside him. In it his books and his wand, in its wrapping, and 10 envelopes, addressed to Mr. H. Potter, 4 Privet Drive, Ive Little Whinging, Surrey. The vault was still full. The train was moving. The morning had turned, by the time they passed out of the city entirely, into something that might, later, be called bright. He had his name on all of them. That was the part that had taken him the longest to understand. Not the money, not the signatures, not even the decade of silence. The part that had taken him the longest was the simplest part. They had always known who he was. Every year, without fail, the bank had written to him, the address updated when he moved, the magic tracking him wherever he went, and the letter always arrived because the letter always knew where he was. Mr. H. Potter. Just that, the same on all 10, in the same careful hand, from the first one to the last. That was what they had tried to keep from him. Not only the gold. The fact that someone, some institution, some system, some annual bureaucratic act of care had been writing his name down and sending it to him faithfully for 10 years, as if to say, "You exist, you are owed something, we have not forgotten you." He had them now. England went by outside the window, green and wide open, and the train carried him north toward a school where people knew his name for entirely different reasons, and Harry Potter, 11 years old, with his mother's eyes and his father's hair and 10 envelopes in his bag, watched it go and thought,